Hello and welcome to a new video in our long-term reading project on Ulysses by James Joyce. So this is the 8th video and all previous videos are compiled in this playlist. And today I put my Odyssey hoodie on for this video. So as usual, this video is structured in chapters, all of which you can access directly via the timestamps and the links given in the video description. So the first chapter of this video is about the plot and the parallels to the original Odyssey. So I think the plot is quickly told. Leopold Bloom wanders through the city. He is walking south from the River Liffey. It's noon. It's around 1 o'clock. So it's time for lunch. And therefore Bloom's thoughts, they constantly revolve around food and edibles. So he observes people and animals and thus reflects on also the nature as being a place of eating or being eaten. And he meets a woman, Mrs. Breen, who was obviously one of his previous flames before he met Molly. And then he goes first into a very simple restaurant, but he's repelled by the dirt, by the noise, and the unappetizing gluttony there. And so he flees to a second, somewhat more upscale pub where he has a gorgonzola sandwich and a glass of red wine. And he also sees his wife's lover, Blazes Boylan, and to avoid encountering Blazes, he flees almost in a panic into a museum. So where are the parallels to the Odyssey here? I think they're clearly in the motif of eating and being eaten. So Odysseus and his companions, they fall into the hand of cannibals on the island of the Lestrygonians. And so first, a scout is eaten by the king and the queen of the Lestrygonians. And when Odysseus and his companions try to flee, many Lestrygonians gather and try to sink the ships. They are successful in doing that. They sink 11 of the 12 ships, and they impale most of Odysseus' traveling companions. They impale them like fish, and they eat them. And so only Odysseus and a few of his companions were able to flee with only one ship. So that's what happens in the Odyssey. Second aspect of this video about the narrative devices in this episode. So first of all, I think the Lestrygonian episode is the longest one so far in our reading project. However, there will be a few significantly longer episodes to come. So in terms of the entire novel, of the entire work, this is a rather medium-length episode. And I would also place it in somewhere in the intermediate range in forms of difficulty to understand this episode. This mix with which we are already quite familiar, this mix of a stream of consciousness featuring Leopold Bloom's fragments of thought, and on rare occasions there are fully formulated thoughts from his perspective, but this stream of consciousness is also repeatedly and almost abruptly interrupted, interspersed without warning with some longer descriptions. And sometimes these longer descriptions are narrated from a personal perspective, that is from Bloom's perspective and experience, but sometimes also from an omniscient perspective. And it's a kind of patchwork technique in which dialogues were also inserted, but both dialogues in which Bloom participates and also those conducted in his absence. And there are sounds and sayings that Bloom hears or reads, although these type of observations are inserted. Texts from posters and banners and advertisements. And I think these are quite typical elements of the big city polyphony. I think this was a quite popular writing technique in the 1920s, extended into the 1930s. We see this also in other novels from the time, such as, for example, in German literature from Alfred Döblin's novel Berlin Alexanderplatz. But of course, this stream of consciousness technique that remains dominant in this episode, this sort of life ticker straight from Bloom's brain. So I think I called it that in that way already a couple of times. So this reads strange, but this is not the clumsy stammering of a writer who cannot write complete sentences, but it's a writing style that was very innovative at the time, and I think it also quite realistically reflects how we human beings, how we actually think when we are just letting our thoughts wander, when we do not have any explicit task at hand, or when we don't have any clear intention to think through a specific topic in a structured and consistent way, perhaps with an eye toward putting it into writing or making an oral statement on it. So that's the way I think we naturally think, if we are allowed to think freely. And I hope that everyone still involved in this project has gotten used to this stream of consciousness technique by now. Sometimes it really does have funny effects, like when Bloom can't remember a person's name at the beginning of the episode, or Pen, something like that. And then dozens of pages later, in the middle of one of his thoughts, then appears this completely out of context fragment. Penrose, that was the guy's name. So this suddenly pops up. And yeah, that's actually how our brains work. Okay, in my third chapter, I would like to take a look at several perspectives, how to possibly read this text. And this text is, I think, about 50 pages, so it's hopeless to provide a detailed analysis here in this video. So therefore, I will instead offer just a few pointers on which methods or perspectives one can use to approach the text for a more detailed analysis. I have 7 specific suggestions which I'd like to briefly outline first, and in the next chapter I'll then use a few examples for each of the 7 approaches to show how one can work with these approaches and how one can work with the text using these approaches, and what levels of meaning and significance may result out of this exercise. So first of all, there are the terms that Joyce himself identified in the schemes that he developed for his friends and colleagues, these 2 interpretive frameworks, the Gilbert scheme and the Linati scheme. So the first one is the Oesophagus, that's the food pipe. Then the second theme is Peristaltics as a technique, as a writing technique. And I think this is closely related to the Oesophagus because it's the wave-like pulsating mechanism of movement or transport by which food is moved downward in the Oesophagus and throughout the digestive tract. The third one is the topic of architecture. The fourth one is the symbol of the Constable, and then there's the color, blood red, and then there's the term despondency, and I'd like to introduce a 7th term, a term that does not appear in any of these schemas, but which is used, I think, in the text, and which has become extremely helpful for me personally in understanding this episode, and to me it has become very central to understanding this episode, the theme of parallax. And I would therefore like to start with this term and examine it in somewhat greater detail. So let's start with this 4th chapter, going through this 7 perspectives or methods, starting with the first one, parallax. First, a clarification. What is parallax? I think in short, parallax is the measurable optical shift in the position of objects caused by a change in the angle of view. And the classic example that also a couple of other commentators on YouTube here on Ulysses mentioned, it's the classic example, the thumb experiment. If you close one eye and look at your thumb, and you look what is the object behind your thumb, and then you switch, you close and close the other eye, then you see that the position of the objects seem to have changed relative to your thumb. So you might also recognize this from driving in your car. If you drive along a road and you look to the left or to the right side, first it may look as though a tree is standing to the left of a house, and then you drive a little further and then it looks as if this tree is standing right in front of the house, and a little further still the tree appears to be on the right hand side of the house. And so It's a very universal and common aspect. In astronomy, this effect is used, for example, to determine the distance to stars. For instance, if you measure the angle at which a star is positioned at a specific time of night on January the 1st, for example, and then 6 months later when the Earth is in a completely different position on its orbit to the Sun, on the exactly opposite side of the Sun, then you measure the angle to the star again, and then you can, using these two angles, you can it's simple geometry, you can construct a triangle and use it to calculate the distance from the Earth to the star. And also the fact that we have different time zones on Earth is also related to a parallax effect. So our measurement of time is defined by the fact that 12 o'clock noon is the time when the sun reaches its highest point at a given location. So, and if we now move a few kilometers east or west from this location, then at that moment the sun is not yet or no longer at the zenith. So it's not yet or no longer noon at this special location. So local noon, and thus the entire system of location and time, it's also therefore a phenomenon of parallax. And this brings us to an important aspect here. So what parallax means on a somewhat more abstract level. So it means that depending on the perspective we take, or the position of things relative to one another changes, and the meaning changes, or the relationship between things and topics changes. They suddenly appear, literally or figuratively, they appear against a completely different backdrop. So colloquially, one would say that's just a matter of perspective. Why use this strange term parallax? So that's certainly correct as well. And a minor technicality on the side would be that the difference between perspective and parallax is that perspective is the general cause and parallax is the concrete, the measurable effect, one that can sometimes even be quantified in numbers. So the difference and relationship between perspective and parallax is not similar to that of gravity and weight. So gravity is the general cause of the mutual attraction of masses, and my weight in kilograms is the measurable effect specific to a particular object, quantifiable. So, but back to parallax, after all this digression on the meaning of the term. So that the value, the meaning, and the relationship to other objects or people or topics, it suddenly changes. It shifts like a parallax when we change our standpoint, our viewpoint, or our perspective. And so for me, this is a key to structuring and understanding this episode. It strikes me that particularly in this episode, Joyce very often employs the technique of having Bloom first view one and the same thing repeatedly from different angles or from different standpoints, and thereby reviewing its multifaceted nature and the diversity of meaning, and also sharpening the reader's awareness that there are various partly equivalent or coexisting frames of reference that can lead to very different statements or assessments about the same object or about the same topic. Okay, that sounded like some pretty theoretical mumbo-jumbo. So what does this have to do with the novel and this episode? I would like to illustrate this with a series of very clear, hopefully clear examples. So we have, first example is the time parallax. Here I'd like to use the example of the time ball at the ballast office that is mentioned in the text. So Bloom himself uses the word parallax here, and he's also aware of its specific astronomical meaning. He thinks about the popular science textbook by Sir Robert Ball, the former director of the Dublin Observatory. And he thinks that I need to brush up my knowledge on this by visiting the observatory, and he even imagines himself, or he imagines introducing himself to the current director, Professor Joly, and so on. Bloom arrives at this train of thought because he notices that this time ball at the ballast office has already dropped, and this ball dropped at 1 p.m. London time, that is Greenwich Mean Time, and it served as a signal for British sailors However, this building in Dublin also housed a clock, another clock, that was controlled by an electric wire directly from the Dublin Observatory, which was based on Dublin solar time. And in 1904, the world was not yet neatly divided into time zones that all differed by just one full hour, as it is today. Instead, at that time, the actual solar time of the respective country's capital was used, at least in some cases, which resulted in some very irregular differences between time zones. So Dublin time was offset by about 25 minutes as compared to the London time. So when the time ball falls, it is 1 p.m. London time, but the most accurate local clock in the immediate vicinity on the same building would show approximately 12:35 p.m. Dublin time. So we have, due to an optical parallax or an astronomical parallax, we have two different time systems that are partly valid in the same location in Dublin. So, and both are correct in their own right, but they are different with also some practical differences. So 1 p.m. for British sailors in Dublin Harbour is the time indicated by the time ball, and it's different than the 1 p.m. for the city's residents. So this isn't spectacular, this is no rocket science, but I think it's a nice example of the coexistence of different and equally valid systems of reference and meaning and time. And so this, the ballast of this building is the nexus of these two different time measuring systems. Second, comes a completely different example of parallax and how perspective shapes meaning. The episode reports that Bloom walks past the statue of the Irish national poet Thomas Moore, and from his perspective, from Bloom's perspective, it looks as though Thomas Moore is pointing with a roguish finger at a public man's urinal. So, quote from the text, "He crossed under Tommy Moore's roguish finger. They did right to put him up over a urinal. Meeting of the waters." And this is a wonderful example because we have several parallaxes here. First, of course, the very basic spatial parallax. It's only from Bloom's very specific vantage point that the impression can arise that the statue is pointing its finger at this urinal booth. And then we have the cultural parallax. So Moore is officially revered as the national poet, a national hero, but Bloom sees this ironic urban reality that the placement also exposes a certain hypocrisy or blindness to unintentional comedy. So, and Meeting of the Waters is actually the title of one of Thomas Moore's most famous poems. But when you have Moore's statue pointing its finger at a public restroom, a public urinal, the frame of reference shifts dramatically. This is a place where very special waters meet. And then there's the fact that, as we learned from Bloom's thoughts, that these public men's restrooms were also a place where, at that time, advertisements for the treatment of sexually transmitted diseases were often posted, diseases like gonorrhea. And officially, these sort of advertisements were illegal at the time. For Bloom, this immediately triggers some unsettling thoughts related to Blazes Boylan, his wife's lover. If he, or what? No, he wouldn't. No, I don't believe. He certainly wouldn't. So the implication is clear. Hopefully, this erotic womanizer, Boylan, hasn't caught any sexually transmitted disease, and he's not going to now infect Molly with it. So several interpretations are possible when looking at the statue and where it finger points. And so the Irish national poet, the romantic poem, the irony of that very poem being linked to something very profane, urination, and also a cautionary reminder of the possible consequences of promiscuity, or also a prime example of clever marketing strategy, all condensed in a few sentences, or even just fragments of sentences. Third example, then there's this Mrs. Breen, formerly Josie Powell. From the hints here and also from later parts of the text, we can conclude that she's a former flame of Bloom's from the time before he met Molly. And this is a fine example of a temporal parallax. Bloom looks at her quite ruthlessly, at how she looks now, decayed, haggard, with a crazy husband. But he also remembers who and what she was and how she looked in the past. So the same person, two different points in time, as two different frames of reference. And the discrepancy to Bloom, it seems to be painful. Fourth example, the seagulls and the bread. Bloom first throws scraps of this religious tract into the water, which the seagulls spurn, and then he throws real breadcrumbs at them, which they eat. And in his mind, he views these seagulls through multiple frames of reference, as birds that must eat, so that's a purely biological perspective. Also as possible reincarnations of departed souls, so there's a mystical, theosophical reference framework, or as a sign of a change in weather, so it's more folkloric aspect. So the same scene, but three different interpretive frameworks, all of which may be plausible in their own right, but which are completely different, completely almost incompatible, or at least they have nothing in common with one another. Then the fifth one is the culinary parallaxes. So Bloom views the same food, for example oysters, he views them through completely different frames of reference, through an aesthetic one, a hygienic one, an erotic one, and an economic one. So he goes on, oysters feed on suspended particles in matter. That is, ultimately they feed on waste, on sewage. So, but they are simultaneously a luxury food, also an aphrodisiac, something slimy and repulsive, and a challenge because they are difficult to open, and they're a social marker. Not everyone can afford them. We'll go into that in more detail later. Or then the sixth example is the woman with a baby. So Bloom views her socio-economically as just an impoverished mother nursing her child. He views her as a victim of male sexual desire, and also as a victim or a fulfiller of religious duties as understood and propagated by the Catholic Church at the time. There are dozens of such examples. So shifts in meaning resulting from Bloom viewing and describing the same thing, the same object or person from different perspectives, one after another. Just a few more briefly touched upon examples that you can explore further on your own. So there's the view of food from different social perspectives. So Burton and David Burns' pub. Then there's the language itself. Bloom often switches between several registers of language in quick succession to describe the same thing or event. So sometimes he's using scientific terms, then very vulgar language, then switching to poetic description, or he switches to the typical advertising jargon. So this clearly shifts the character and the connotations of each of the objects he's describing in the text. Then there is the different perspectives on religious dietary laws. Bloom reflects on, from a Jewish perspective, on kosher food as he walks through a Christian Catholic Dublin. So the same foods are pure or impure depending on the religious framework that one applies. So this becomes very clear with the topic of blood, which is absolutely unclean, impure from the Jewish perspective. But on the Christian, in Christian theology, as mentioned on the Christian flyer, this religious tract, this mention of the blood of the Lamb that washes away sin. So their blood is not impure, but has a purifying effect. It's as a metaphor for Christ's death on the cross. or the potted meat advertisement just below the obituaries. So technically a well-crafted ad copy, but its placement gives it a very macabre tone, so which incidentally also picks up on the cannibalism theme associated with this episode. And or Bloom's thought experiment on what it would be like to be a woman. So it must be strange not to have what? So that is the strange notion of not having male genitalia. What does it feel like? So it's a somatic parallax, so to speak. And he'll come back to this thought in a later episode again, for example, in Nausicaa. As I said, this is just a small selection of parallaxes that can be found. It's just intended as an inspiration for you to go searching for more of these yourself. To encourage your own analysis, I'd like to take it one step further and like to take a look on a more abstract level at the mechanism how these parallaxes function or work, and not as an end in itself, but because I think this could hopefully help sharpen your eye for where such parallaxes can still be found in the text. 3 examples of, let's call it, systematics that Joyce plays with here, or that can at least be identified as a way of reading the text. First, I think there's a certain hierarchy of parallaxes. Joyce seems to be attempting to cover all possible scales, from the outer cosmic things to the inner physical, in a sort of an encyclopedic endeavor. So we have this cosmic astronomical parallaxes like times and planets and the sun. We have the resulting geographical political parallaxes, London, Dublin, time zone, but also colonial power and the perspective of the colonized people. We have the social parallaxes related to classes, to gender, to religion. And we have a psychological temporal parallax. So events experienced or remembered or hoped for or feared. And then a second point is that we have sensory parallaxes. The same object is described differently depending on the mode of perception. So the visual seems to be dominant, but also the olfactory, so the smells, and the gustatory, the taste, the auditory, the sound impressions, and also the tactile, the texture of objects, like the texture of food and clothing. Sometimes Joyce is working through all these dimensions, one after the other, for the same object. And for the philosophy nerds, I would like to go into a bit more into detail into one specific rabbit hole, and that is that I think Joyce is also tapping from here. That's the scholastic Aristotelian doctrine of the so-called 4 causes. If that seems too far-fetched to you now, I don't think it is. We know very well, for example, from Joyce's extensive notebooks, that he engaged very intensively with Aristotle and with Thomas Aquinas in particular, and much of his intellectual engagement with these 2 philosophers also found its way into numerous episodes of Ulysses. I'm not just making this up my own. For those interested in a more detailed analysis with numerous examples, I can recommend this book, Joyce, Aristotle and Aquinas, by Fran O'Rourke, published by the University Press of Florida. I think about 25 euros as an ebook. Okay, what is it about this scholastic Aristotelian doctrine of the 4 causes? The so-called scholastics were medieval philosophers and theologians trained primarily in the philosophy of Aristotle. And these medieval scholastic developed a highly complex and sophisticated philosophical system for describing reality. And a core element of the system was this doctrine of the 4 causes. And the central idea is that every object, or rather any phenomenon, can be fully described and fully understood when it is examined through 4 different explanatory frameworks. the causa materialis, so that's the material cause, what is it made of, the causa formalis, the formal cause, how is it shaped, the causa efficiens, so the efficient cause, by what does it come into being, or how is it brought about, and the causa finalis, so the final cause, for what purpose. Especially when it comes to the topic of food and a whole range of foodstuffs, the text, I think, demonstrates that all four facets, all four dimensions, all four causes can be systematically examined in accordance with this scholastic doctrine of the four causes. And Bloom is more or less applying this, seems to be applying this framework. So the causa materialis, so what is it made of? Let's take a look at this, the description of Bloom in the second restaurant with this sip of wine after a bite of the gorgonzola sandwich. So wine soaked and softened, rolled bread, crumb, mustard, and momentarily cloying cheese. I think that, to quote more literally from the text, wine permeated and softened the rolled bread, crumb, the mustard, the cheese that was only momentarily cloying. So the food is reduced to its material substance, to properties such as texture and taste and temperature. So food is a mere matter that is fed to the body. And then causa formalis, the formal cause. How is it structured? Quote from the text, sandwich, Ham and his descendants, mustard and bread there, potted meats. So it's on the focus of food as a specific culture form, the sandwich as a specific form of presentation for ham with mustard and bread, and potted meat or canned meat as a commercial form of packaging or a presentation. Sandwiches and canned meat are not merely matter, but they are food that has been shaped into a specific form through certain cultural techniques. So there are many additional dimensions in this short sentence. If you take a look at the way it is written, so ham is written in a way that it also makes reference to Noah's son, then his descendants makes more sense, or mustard and bread, like mustard and bread. So both words have duplicate meanings, etc. But let's stick to the four cases for now. Then this causa efficient causa, what caused it? What causes it? So again, quote from the text, feel better, Burgundy, good pick me up, who distilled first? Some chap in the blues, Dutch courage. So the causa efficient on wine is who made it, but also what effect does the wine have on me? And that leads directly to the fourth dimension, to the fourth cause, causa finalis, the final cause, for what purpose? Also quote from the text, or paraphrase from the text, so kosher, no meat and milk together, hygiene, that's what they call it now, Yom Kippur fast, spring cleaning from the inside. So food, or the way we eat or we do not eat, we fast, that serves multiple purposes. It's nutrition, survival, it's about ritual, purity, hygiene and health, all the way to politics. Again, quote from the text, peace and war depend on some fellow's digestion. So the causa finalis, the final cause, that splits into completely different and also in part again incompatible teleologies or purposes. That is a parallax within the parallax. So no phenomenon can be fully explained just by sticking to a single cause. The four causes are themselves distinct frames of references that cannot necessarily be aligned or reduced to one another. A medieval scholastic would have attempted to arrange these causes hierarchically, likely with the causa finalis as the highest one, but Joyce does not make it that clear and simple for us. So, as food for thought or for your own work on the text, I think with this expanded knowledge of various systems or types of parallaxes, you can certainly find much more within the text. What Joyce demonstrates here, in my opinion, both through the many parallaxes and by employing not just one type or system of parallaxes, but a diverse range of them, what he demonstrates is the relativism or perspective that is so characteristic of modernism. There is no longer a single closed worldview or explanatory model. The modern individual is spoiled for choice among many systems of references and values and many different possible explanations, none of which holds unchallenged primacy anymore, and which sometimes they complement one another, but sometimes they are completely incompatible. They're even competing. So, and this mindset of relativism and pluralism of perspective, this has become quite self-evident to us today in the 21st century. But so a good 100 years later, but we should not forget that at the time of the novel's plot in 1904, this was by no means the case. That it was only then that people began to break away from the grand theories and ideologies that claimed the authority to interpret and to explain everything and to be the sole source of knowledge and salvation. So it was a time when statements like Nietzsche's, I paraphrase here, there are no facts, there are only interpretations, when statements like this were still very new and even scandalous. And it was not until 1 year later, in 1905, that Einstein's theory of relativity appeared, showing that even very fundamental dimensions such as space and time and mass, they are not absolute quantities. And yet another year later, in 1906, Cubism was born in painting, so daring for the first time to depict multiple perspectives of the same object simultaneously on the same canvas. So this is a time where this idea just emerges, the idea of relativism, pluralism, and the plurality of perspectives. The novel is set against the backdrop of this era of upheaval, and so it was exceptionally new and innovative to orchestrate such a polyphonic encyclopedic structure here, and one that reveals how this fragmentation into competing systems of reference and meaning that already occurs within the stream of consciousness of a single person. Leopold Bloom, like all people of the modern age, he has inherited many systems that still claim to explain the world completely, a religious framework, a scientific, a philosophical, and an aesthetic one. But the people become more and more aware that none of these can really explain the world to us in a completely coherent way, and none can replace all the others. And Bloom, as a man of the modern age, he lives in a fragmented relativistic world. So, okay, that was perhaps a bit too much highbrow philosophy. Back to the more down-to-earth work on the text. We have now covered the topic of parallaxes exhaustively, I think, but in doing so, we have only examined one of 7 possible perspectives on the text. Let's move on to the second one, the oesophagus, the food pipe. So, the fact that in the text everything revolves around eating, around the intake of food, that surely comes as no surprise to anyone who has read the text. And the oesophagus is, of course, a central organ for this. If you read through the text a bit more carefully, you'll notice that when it comes to eating, it is not so much about the mouth, about the chewing, or the stomach and the intestines, the digestion and excretion that play a role, but it's rather the swallowing and the transport processes taking place in the esophagus. Swallowing and belching, hiccups and rumination and regurgitating partially digested food and so on. And even vomiting is mentioned. So the transport of solids, water or gases through the esophagus in both directions is described repeatedly in the text. So in terms of digestion, the esophagus has a special role because it's something of just a transitional and transport organ. Nothing really happens here with the food except for the transport itself. So chewing that takes place in the mouth, where first digestive enzymes are already secreted, but then the real digestion continues in the stomach. But the esophagus is really just a passageway. And this motive of passage, of transition, I think it also plays an important, obvious role in the text. And several so-called rites of passage are also mentioned here in this text that links very well to this transitional, to this function as a passageway, the classic Catholic baptism, and washed in the blood of the Lamb, more an allusion to conversion or a revival experience in the evangelical tradition. And also a self-proclaimed spiritual leader is mentioned who considers himself the prophet Elijah, which ties in with a Jewish legend according to which the prophet Elijah is to reappear shortly before the arrival of the Messiah. So again, a transitional phase, so to speak, before the actual redemption. So this perspective on the themes of transport, transition, passageway, rites of passage, that might also be worth considering upon in a second reading of the text. Some interpreters also view the whole episode as a transitional one within the novel's overall structure. So it is following the introduction of the characters in the first episode and the introduction of the existential theme of death in the Hades episode, and then the view of life as much ado about nothing in the Aeolus episode. But so that a lot happens here in the first episodes, but here nothing particularly substantial actually happens in this episode. So Bloom fortifies himself for the afternoon, for things to come, which of course then everything becomes highly intellectual again at the National Library, but not that much happens in this episode itself. So it's a sort of a passageway, transitional stage. I'm not entirely convinced by this theory, but I wanted to mention it, to leave it to you to judge about it, whether it's convincing or not. Here's another tidbit from the category of trivia or interesting and entertaining speculations. Some experts on the text also see the Oesophagus motive reflected in the description of Bloom's route in this episode, and I don't think that it's so far-fetched. I have to go and pick up a map. Just give me a second. Okay, if you take a look at how the esophagus runs in the human body, so slightly curved from bottom to top, and then at least from the front, it is spanning to the right toward the stomach. And in this annotated German edition of the Ulysses, this comes with a couple of maps about the movement of the main characters in the streets of Dublin, and this one is the map of Bloom's movement in the Lestrygonian episode. I've highlighted his route here with a highlighter, and I don't think that the resemblance with the way the esophagus runs is all that far-fetched. Okay, let's move on to the third point. Peristaltics. It's another term from the Gilbert scheme about this writing or narrative technique in this episode. I think this is obviously closely related to the concept of the esophagus. Peristaltic, the term refers precisely to this wave-like movement through a muscular tube like the esophagus. So this wave-like motion back and forth, slightly forward, then a bit back again, then another big push forward. I think this could also be described, to put it simply, as a sort of a rhythmic oscillation. And I'll present a detailed example from the text here that nicely illustrates how this inch by inch pushing forward, then sliding back, then another big thrust forward, how this becomes visible in the text right down to the sentence structure of Bloom's thoughts. I'll take the part where Bloom muses on oysters, and this also serves to illustrate also the four-cause theory once more. I quote from the text, yes, but what about oysters? Unsightly like a clot of phlegm, filthy shells, step 1. Material nature, causa materialis. Devil to open them too. Step 2, availability, handling, perhaps also causa formalis, how is it designed? Who found them out? Step 3, causa efficiens, how does it come about on the cultural level? Garbage, sewage they feed on. Step 4, causa efficiens, how does it come about now on the material, biological level? Fizz and red bank oysters, effect on the sexual, Aphrodite. Step 5, causa finalis, final cause, for what purpose? He was in the Red Bank this morning. Step 6. More of a standstill, a distracting thought of Blazes Boylan, whom he saw this morning in front of the Red Bank restaurant. Oh, mind's eye. Did Molly's lover get oysters to have more virility when he will have young flesh in the bed? A move forward, an unpleasant thought for a loving husband. No, June has no oysters. So step 7, finally a small leap forward again to cultural and hygiene related rules about when to eat oysters. But there are people who like tainted game. Step 8, after much oscillation around the oysters, now finally a bigger thematic step forward toward game, hares, Chinese eggs. But 5 sentences later, another wave-like movement back to the oysters, yet thematically a good deal further along. Now in one of Leopold Bloom's typical merchant mind games involving buying, selling, and making money. Half the catch of oysters they throw back in the sea to keep up the price. So we have, on this example with the oyster, we have this undulating pattern moving forward and back and forth around the oysters. And this is also reflected in his rhythm of walking. So if you take a look at how it is walking is described, he walked along Grafton Street, he walked toward Dawson Street, he quickened his pace slackened. The act of walking is itself, it's described in a peristaltic way, in like acceleration, deceleration, and this back and forth rhythm. And also the stream of consciousness oscillates between external perception and internal reflection. So the present and the memory, and the abstract thought and the sensory perception. Or his attitude towards Molly. It is surprising how many external events prompt Bloom to think of Molly. And here too, there's a back and forth on the emotional level. At times, he becomes aware of the distance between them. Then he feels concern or jealousy. And then there's emotional withdrawal and almost resignation. And I think this also might also be a rewarding way to approach the text, to trace the ebb and flow, the peristaltics of Bloom's thoughts about Molly in this episode. The fourth aspect, architecture, and I'd like to say very little about this now. It's another one of those points that are more interesting or fruitful for Irish people or for Dubliners. After all, many buildings and fountains and parks and public spaces and monuments and shops, etc. are mentioned, and some are mentioned multiple times, first viewed from a distance and then up close. And this is certainly a valid perspective on the text, but it requires, to analyze this, I think this requires more local knowledge than I can provide. The fifth one is the symbol of the constables. Well, at first glance, there aren't many policemen in this episode. At one point, it says a group of constables bursts out of College Street, but that's about it. And yet the term constable is explicitly listed under the symbol category in the Gilbert scheme. So I think it's more about what a constable stands for. It's about a constable or a policeman's role is about monitoring compliance with rules and norms. It's sort of an ethical or normative controlling, monitoring authority. And I believe it's more about this topic here. The constable symbol links to the motive about regulation, self-control, and the enforcement of norms, and that's also on multiple levels. Let's go through a few of these levels. So we have this aspect of self-regulation and internal censorship. Bloom seems to be his own policeman here a couple of times. He constantly regulates himself. He regulates his appetite, his thoughts. So when his fantasies become too obscene or too painful, he stops them. Stop, it's in a text. Or no. His social behavior, his language, he constantly corrects himself mentally. He corrects his own mistake about the time, about his botched version of the proverb to be born with a silver spoon in one's mouth, and so on. And we have frequent mentioning of social norms as a controlling authority. So the entire episode is permeated by invisible social policemen. So his wife will put a stop to that. Kosher, no meat and milk together. The norm works because they are deeply internalized by Bloom. So we also see a couple of hints at imperial control by the colonizers. So in Dublin in 1904, the state executive, whether police or administration, is not neutral, but is a representative of British rule. And even time is corrected from the outside. And we have the aspect of moral surveillance. So despite his sometimes obscene and blasphemous thoughts, Bloom is also a kind of a moral conscience on patrol through the city. He judges the distributors of pious tracts. He judges the people who are dining at the Burtons. He judges the priest who is handing out candies to children. So I think this could too be a rewarding perspective on the text, to look at it from the aspect of regulation, order, control, both external control through social norms and colonial power, but also regulation and control as an internal self-control mechanism driven by conscience and reason. So I think Bloom is on patrol through the city and also on patrol in his own consciousness. So this level takes on a special twist when it intersects with the theme of the parallaxes. I think that the concept is not to be understood as a counterweight to the parallax chaos, because he does not represent a single homogeneous order. Even the norms that repeatedly prompt self-corrections in Bloom's thoughts, they are not homogeneous. They are somewhat fragmented and even sometimes contradictory. So let's take a look at what different norms do we have here. We have contradictory religious norms: Jewish, Christian, Catholic, this sort of evangelical initiative, and also esoteric theosophical religious norms. We'll come back to that later in this video. So then we have social classes, each with their own norms and moral codes. The working class at Burton's, so it's focused on fast, cheap food. The norm is efficiency and quantity. And the middle class at David Byrne's moral pub, the norm is moderation, discretion, decency. Or the upper class restaurants at Shelburne, the fine dining, so it's different again. So what is required by a norm or considered normal in one class would be considered inappropriate in another class or context. Then we have different gender norms. So women as regulators who control male excess, but we also have women as objects dominated by male sexuality and dominated by the church's sexual ethics, and also women as sort of ethereal aesthetic beings. Women eat daintily and appetizingly. And we have also a difference between aesthetic norms and economic norms. So on the one hand, I hate dirty eaters, so the norm is cleanliness and dignity while eating, and the other hand, the economic reality. As mentioned, a restaurant where knives and forks are chained to the table, which seems almost bestial. So the norm is here, there's survival, efficiency, theft prevention. So, and the moral of the story, I think, is that in this plurality of values and perspectives, there is no longer any meta-police, no overarching single norm capable of regulating all the other norms. The constable, the authority figure responsible for norm and order, this figure itself is fragmented, is a victim of the parallax effect. Sixth point of this chapter is the color blood red. This color is not mentioned in the Gilbert scheme, but it does appear in the Linati scheme for this episode. And just a quick note on that, the motif of blood red appears in several places in the episode. For example, related to the religious sacrificial blood, so Christ's blood as the blood of the Lamb, as biological blood, so especially in connection with the birth, and then the sensual blood red color, like the color of the Burgundy wine. The blood of the lamb on the religious leaflet at the beginning, I think that sets the leitmotif that that continues through Bloom's thoughts on sacrifice, violence, and birth. And the phrase recurs throughout the episode. And the blood red color of the wine may also become an erotic symbol that evokes this Howth memory of Bloom's first romantic encounter with Molly, almost like the taste of the Madeleine in Proust's In Search of Lost Time. And the color blood also connects the cannibalistic Lestrygonians with the men in Burton who devour bloody meat, and with Christian theology and salvation, and with Bloom's own Jewish outsider status, because he is not, as a Jew, he is probably not washed in the blood of the Lamb. A seventh point that is mentioned in the Gilbert scheme is the term despondency. And I don't want to cite specific examples from the text here, but if one listens to Bloom's inner monologue with a little bit of empathy, I think one quickly realizes that we are dealing with a sort of despondent man here. He tries to repress the fact that he's about to be cuckolded this afternoon. He wavers between memories of an idealized past, but he's repeatedly jolted back by the contrast with the unbearable present and the unbearable thoughts of the state of his marriage and what will happen this afternoon in his absence at his home. So me and me now, me back then. And what am I today? I was happier then. Oh, was that me? And so he even doubts whether the happy self from back then was really himself at all. Happier then, happier back then. That too, it's an almost mantra-like invocation of past happiness, but one that offers him no real comfort. Okay, let's move on to the fifth chapter of the video, and this is sort of a bonus with three digressions on side topics that I personally find interesting little rabbit holes that we can dive into together. The first one is about George Russell, also known as Mr. Geo, or he himself also adopted the pseudonym AE, an abbreviation of the Greek term aeon, meaning eternity, though he lived only from 1867 to 1935, so not that much of eternity, or whatever. George Russell was a so-called theosophist, a mystic, a poet, a painter, and also an editor of the magazine The Irish Homestead, and where Joyce published his first Dubliner stories. So perhaps I need to explain, or should explain, what the term theosophist means, what it is or what it was. Theosophy was a spiritual esoteric movement around 1900, also prevalent in Ireland, a movement that sought to combine Eastern philosophy and occultism and mystical Western traditions. And it was particularly popular among Irish intellectuals and artists such as William Butler Yeats, and George Russell. And it was closely linked to a literary movement aimed at reviving traditional Irish elements in literature, the so-called Irish Literary Revival. And it sought a specifically Irish synthesis of Celtic mythology, Indian philosophy, and some universal spiritual wisdom beyond the theology of the established churches. And that was the environment where AE also played a role as one of the four thinkers. So he appears in the episode as a bearded figure on a bicycle, emerging from a vegetarian restaurant with a woman listening intently at his side. So I quote or paraphrase from the text. They passed from behind Mr. Bloom along the curbstone, beard and bicycle, young woman. And now switching to Bloom's thoughts, and there he is too. Now that's really a coincidence. Second time coming events that cast their shadows before, with the approval of the eminent poet Mr. Geo Russell. So, and then 2 whole paragraphs follow with thoughts about AE and AE's viewpoints. And so one might ask the question, why does this oddball get a whole page in Ulysses? Well, it's a bit complicated, probably. Joyce had a complicated relationship with AI, with George Russell. At first, from 1902 to 1904, AE was a kind of a mentor figure for the young James Joyce. He introduced Joyce to Dublin's literary circles. He commissioned him to write for the journal, the Irish Homestead, and he also gave him literary advice, which in the beginning Joyce followed and picked up, later not that much. So but the relationship was a bit ambivalent from the start, because AE dared to criticize Joyce's arrogance and Joyce's negativity. And Joyce, in turn, he despised AE's mystical folk, his Celtic twilight kitsch. So to Joyce, AE represented everything that Joyce himself rejected about the Irish literary revival, this backward-looking romanticization, the nebulous spiritualism, and this naive national self-glorification. And Joyce saw AE and Yeats' literary project as escapism. So instead of confronting the harsh reality of modern colonial Catholic Dublin, they fled into a mythical past. And instead of precise and realistic prose, they fled into vague, beautiful poetry. And instead of addressing political and social problems, they mystified the so-called Irish soul and idealized a heroic Irish past. So AE's appearance in the Lestrygonians episode is therefore, it's not flattering. So there is a passage in the episode where Bloom admits that what AE stands for example, vegetarianism, that it is certainly better for the animals in principle. But yeah, it becomes clear that he doesn't think much of this mystically tinged concept of diet as a sort of a substitute religion. He is typically, Bloom, he is very pragmatic and skeptical. He tried vegetarianism once and he found it impractical. Flatulence and constantly having to run to the bathroom, and he thinks about a certain vegetarian recipe like nut steak, so that is the 1900s version of a vegan schnitzel, and it seems to him like self-deception. So vegetarians want steak without steak, a hypocrisy of asceticism. I try to quote from the text, saying, coming from the vegetarian at restaurant. So only veg bubbles and fruit. Don't eat a beefsteak. If you do, the eyes of that cow will. If you do, the eyes of that cow will pursue you through all eternity. They say it's healthier. Wind and watery, though. Tried it. Keep you on the run all day. Bad as a bloater. Dreams all night. Why do they call that thing they gave me a nut steak? Nutarians, fruitarians? To give you the idea you're eating rump steak? Absurd. Salty too. They cook in soda. Keep you sitting by the tap all the night. So that's the first round of criticism, still very superficial on external things like the food they prefer. But he also addresses the literary works of AE and his circle. So those literary ethereal people, they are all dreamy, cloudy, symbolistic aesthetes they are. I wouldn't be surprised if it was that kind of food you see produces the like waves of the brain, the poetical. So yeah, it makes a connection between the food and the second-class literary products. So if you write that into a novel, I think you couldn't turn away from your former mentor any more clearly. So why does he do that? I think AE serves in this episode as a kind of anti-Bloom. Simply, as a means of clarification through contrast. And the contrast couldn't be greater. A.E., a vegetarian, ascetic, mystic, he sees invisible worlds, he proclaims absolute truth, he has actual disciples, one female disciple actually accompanies him, listening devoutly, ascetic clothing, transcendence everywhere. And Bloom, just the opposite. He enjoys meat, he enjoys the inner organs, he's sensual, he's empiristic, he only trusts his senses, he's a relativist, a perspectivist, and yeah, he's isolated, and he cares about fashion and appearance. And so A.E. represents an anti-materialistic, anti-sensual worldview that is fundamentally alien to the way Bloom sees the world. So I think for Joyce, A.E. is a symbol of escape from reality. And so instead of confronting the concrete, grimy, real Dublin, as Bloom does by walking through the city, smelling, eating, sweating, desiring, A.E. flees into mystical visions, cosmic abstractions, an idealized Celtic past, and something like spiritual purity. So I think this can also be linked back to the parallax theme. A.E. embodies the desire for a unified, absolute perspective, the mystical vision that all things, the mystical vision that views all things from the standpoint of a one transcendent eternity. And this is the exact opposite of the parallax framework through which Joyce attempts to demonstrate to us the impossibility of an absolute vantage point. So A.E. and Bloom represent two fundamentally different responses to the crisis of modernity. A.E. stands for an escape into transcendence and mysticism, into pre-modern worldview, anti-modernism, and Bloom stands for the acceptance of plurality, relativity, corporeality, and ambiguity. Although he suffers from it, but he accepts it. And Joyce shows both, but I think his sympathy clearly lies with Bloom. So yeah, I think that this Ulysses episode is also a monument against the kind of mystical escapism that A.E. embodies. Yet Joyce is not particularly scathing in his criticism. I believe that for Joyce, A.E.'s worldview was a well-intentioned aberration, an attempt doomed to failure to circumvent the complexity and harshness of the modern world through spiritual simplification, but a well-meant aberration. So A.E.'s appearance in this episode, I think, is also a fine example of Joyce's ironic humor. In an episode about food and hunger, the body, digestion, filth, that is, in an episode about the pure materiality and grittiness of our human existence, right in the middle of it appears the mystic who wants to deny all of that and who dreams of a world without all this grittiness. Okay, let's move on to a completely different topic and rabbit hole. At the heart of the episode lies Bloom's memory of his first true romantic encounter with Molly. And this memory is triggered by the taste of Burgundy wine, and so the wine's warmth on his palate, that sets the stage for the memory of their romantic encounter in a meadow or a heathland against a mountain backdrop. Pillowed on my coat, she had her hair, earwigs in the heather scrubbed my hand under her nape. Oh, wonder! Cool, soft with ointments, her hand touched me, caressed. Her eyes upon me did not turn away. Ravished over her, I lay, full lips full open, kissed her mouth. Yum! Softly she gave me in my mouth the seed cake, warm and chewed. Joy, I ate it, joy. Young life, her lips that gave me pouting. Soft, warm, sticky gum jelly lips. Flowers her eye were. Take me, willing eyes. Pebbles fell. She lay still. A goat. No one. High on Ben Howth, rhododendrons. A nanny goat walking sure-footed, dropping currants. Screened under ferns she laughed, warm-folded. A woman's breasts full in her blouse. I find this passage interesting in several respects. First of all, it's striking evidence of Joyce's Christian biblical influence. I think anyone familiar with the poetic books of the Old Testament may have paused a bit at this deliberately condensed version I just recited. And I think everyone who is familiar with these poetic books of the Old Testament would have noticed the echoes of the so-called Song of Songs from the Old Testament. These are very old love poems with a few characteristic motifs that resound here in Joyce's text as well. So there's this motive of anointing. So Joyce, cool soft with ointments, her hand touched me. Song of Songs, the fragrance of your ointments is delightful. And the motive of the head resting and the hair. Joyce pillowed on my coat, she had her hair, earwigs in the heather scrub, my hand under her nape. Song of Songs, his left hand is under my head. The hair of your head is like purple. The motive of goats and their kids on the mountains. Joyce, a goat high on Ben Howth, rhododendrons, a nanny goat walking sure-footed. Song of Songs, feed your kids. Your hair is like a flock of goats descending from Mount Gilead. The breast motive. A woman's breasts full in her blouse, I lay wildly upon her. Song of Songs, my beloved, he rests between my breasts. Or the comparison of the beloved to plants. Joyce, flowers her eyes were. Song of Songs, your figure is like a palm tree, and your breasts like clusters of grapes. I will climb the palm tree. Yes, that's what it says there. Oniswaki malibons. The Old Testament is far more sensual and life-affirming than Christian theology has been willing to admit for many centuries. He compares the body to a palm tree, and then I will climb this palm tree. Okay, the cake motive. And in Joyce, Molly Bloom feeds him pre-chewed cake, seed cake. And Song of Songs, strengthen me with grape cake, for I am sick with love. And also, the woman as the true initiator is also present in both texts. In Joyce, it is already hinted at the point that Molly is taking the reins here, with a bit more to come later. And so it is in the Song of Psalms. Come, my beloved, let us go out into the fields and spend the night among the cypress flowers. Draw me after you, and we will run. Let him kiss me with the kisses of his mouth. So what Joyce represents here, these are not literal quotations from the biblical Song of Songs, but I do believe that this compilation beautifully illustrated how systematically Joyce mirrors the erotic imagery of the Song of Songs in this Howth memory. The anointing, the resting head, the mountainhead landscape with grazing goats and their kids, the hair, the breasts, the plant comparisons, the cake, the initiating woman, the kissing of the kissed mouth. A biblical text clearly, to me, becomes the subtext of Bloom's love memory here. So before this gets too sentimental, I want to shift the focus and want to invite you to do something one doesn't usually do, namely to take a look at the end of the book, the last 2.5 pages of the novel. So spoiler alert here. This will clearly tell you something about the plot. But if you don't mind, please take a look at these final 2.5 pages of the novel. This is Molly's inner monologue in bed at night, just before she falls asleep. So it is a stream of consciousness par excellence, spanning dozens of pages, but we're only concerned with the last 2 here. On the first half page, we learn a little about Molly's love of flowers, which casts the whole idea of Leopold using pictorial flower language as a secret code, cast that into a different light. Followed by her mocking thoughts on atheism, which she considers just as unprovable as other religious beliefs. But then it gets interesting. She recalls the love scene with Leopold Bloom on Ben Howth, now from her perspective. And I think it's fascinating to examine this and to compare the two memories. So where are the similarities and where are the differences in the way that Bloom remembers this and that Molly remembers this? And I just like to offer 2 points. The first think is important for understanding the relationship between Molly and Leopold. To him, she was the center of the universe. But in her version, it becomes clear from the very start, he wasn't her, the only one, the center of the universe. He wasn't her Prince Charming. He was nothing more than just a welcome opportunity, one among many possible alternatives. So a purely pragmatic choice, not a passionate one. And she manipulated him from the very beginning. I thought, well him as another. And then I asked him with my eyes to ask again. Yes, and then he asked me, would I? Yes, to say yes, my mountain flower. And first I put my arms around him, yes, and drew him down to me so he could feel my breasts, all perfume. Yes, and his heart was going like mad. And yes, I said, yes, I will, yes. So I think that with the knowledge of this emotional asymmetry between the two of them from the very beginning, the awkwardness of this marriage becomes somewhat easier to understand. And the second point is a tiny but important detail that only in retrospect sheds light on key points in the novel's plot, exemplifying how this novel is constructed. Molly recalls here that Bloom was wearing a straw hat that day on Ben Howth during the first real love scene where he also proposed to her. And this detail is, I think, as if the stage light suddenly is turned on retroactively in the Hades episode and in the Lestrygonian episode. This straw hat, it was in Dublin in 1904, it was an unusual and a striking head covering in Dublin. So where gentlemen typically wore darker hats such as bowler hats. And a straw hat had always been the distinguishing mark of Molly's lover Blazes Boylan in the previous episodes. In Hades and in the Lestrygonians and later again in the Sirens. But that straw hat, it was the headgear that Bloom wore on the day he proposed to Molly. So for him, the straw hat was an almost sacred memory. So as the reference to the Old Testament Song of Song makes clear. So, and that now I think it makes it all the more painful that a straw hat is now the distinguishing mark of this vain dandy whom Molly brings into her bed. So I think this too makes Bloom's behavior even more understandable. But it is also, I think, a didactically very suitable example to demonstrate how this novel works. It works in retrospect, in reverse. Many details that seem either completely irrelevant or even chaotically thrown in during the first reading. All of a sudden, they become clear in later episodes, and now they are revealing their meaning only in retrospect. And this is, I think, the straw hat motive is a perfect example, because the real meaning, really, we learn about this on the final 2 pages. And then we understand why Bloom reacts in such an emotional way when he sees this straw hat of Blazes Boylan. Let's take another look at the detail that might seem unclear at first glance. In the Calypso episode, we discussed how Bloom sees Molly as his Calypso in this episode, and as the woman who holds him captive, from whom he cannot escape. And now let's look at the Lestrygonian episode, the passage where Bloom recalls the love scene in the mountains and his marriage proposal. So what frames it? What sentences come immediately before and immediately after Bloom's memory of this scene? Before, stuck on the pane, 2 flies, buzzed, stuck. And after, again the flies, stuck, the flies buzzed. Is this a coincidence? Is this the meaningless babbling of a crazy Irishman who's had a few too many pints? Or is it perhaps a rather shrewd narrator who can pull out all the stops when it comes to symbolic language and hidden allusions? And he's looking at, these two are glued together like the 2 flies on a pane who are stuck and cannot escape. So that's another perspective. So it is not just an Odysseus who is unilaterally bewitched and held captive by a Calypso, but these are 2 beings who perhaps through their own fault, through carelessness, are stuck to something and to each other and cannot break free, no matter how violently they buzz. I don't know whether this is true or speculation. I leave the judgment up to you. I think it can't be a coincidence that these short sentences about the flies that are stuck on the pane are immediately before and after Bloom's memory of this romantic episode. Third point, I have one last point. Yes, that is likely going to be another excessively long video. And that's why I'm only touching on it briefly as food for thought. I had attended a seminar on Dante's Divine Comedy at the university over the summer. And this seminar was focused on the first part of Dante's Divine Comedy, the Inferno, Hell. So it's not that long ago, so I still have a fairly good grasp of its structure and its content. I think it's well known that Joyce was also very familiar with Dante's comedy. So there are, after all, countless direct Dante quotations in Ulysses. But I've also noticed an interesting structural connection here. The episodes 7 and 8 of Ulysses, I think they run in parallel in content to Canto 26, 33 and 34 of Dante's Inferno. And the connection is established through three leitmotifs: failure in the wind, cold, and devouring. In Canto 26, Dante and Virgil, they encounter Odysseus, who tells them a story not recorded by Homer of just another shipwreck that must have taken place after the episode with the Lestrygonians, since there's only one ship left. And as Dante and his guide, Virgil, then move on and approach the lowest point of hell, they actually perceive a strong wind blowing against them. And then comes the cold, a lake frozen solid, and among the damned who are trapped there in holes in the ice, cannibalistic feasting plays a thematically important role. In Canto 33, for example, Dante encounters Count Ugolino, who eternally gnaws at the skull of his adversary, Archbishop Ruggieri. The story behind that is that Ugolino and his sons were locked in a tower by Ruggieri and were left to starve to death. And Dante leaves open the question whether, in his desperation, Ugolino ate his own starved sons, whom he outlived for a few days. So the cannibalism is hinted at. And the wind is also already perceptible in Canto 33. And the theme of eating, devouring, cannibalism is hinted at in Canto 34, when the bottom of hell is reached. Lucifer sits on the ground, all the wind emanates from him, and what he does is very telling. He eats, and indeed like a cannibal, he eats traitors such as Judas, who betrayed Christ, but also Brutus and Cassius, so from Roman antiquity. So three figures who in Dante's time were considered the greatest traitors in human history. So this sequence, Odysseus' shipwreck in the wind, cold, and eating, specifically cannibalistic eating, that is also drawn from Dante. And it is precisely this sequence that Joyce parallels here. Aeolus represents Leopold's failure in the wind, or the storm of the newspaper world. Then the Lestrygonians represent eating and being eaten. And if one reads the text carefully, one will also, even though it is June, one will find several references to cold, and above all to rigidity caused by cold. So there's, for example, talk of the statues, they're looking like they are frozen stiff in the cold, and there's speculation about the cosmic death by freezing of the universe, and also about how certain fatty foods must be eaten warm before they grow cold and solidify. So I think now, with this context in mind, the reference to Dante, also some of Bloom's chains of association and his thoughts become somewhat clearer. For example, when in Hades he does not directly compare the Eucharist with cannibalism, but at least connects the two. And this is already laid out in Dante, and specifically as a contrast, just as Christ gives his life and ultimately also gives his body for consumption. The perverted reflection of this is what happens to those who do exactly the opposite, who are not giving their lives for their friends, but who are betraying their friends. They too have to offer their bodies for consumption, but not voluntarily, but rather as a punishment. They are eaten in a cannibal-like manner. So with this juxtaposition, Dante opens up a rather large theological can of worms that would be a topic for a video series on the Divine Comedy. And I think Joyce picks up on it. And as usual, not a one-to-one mirroring, but naturally adapted to his context. But I find this episode a fine example of how one can work with this layers methods here again. It is an episode that beautifully illustrates how a nexus forms between at least 3 layers: Homer, Dante, and Dublin. Okay, well, that was a lot of information. I hope I have been able to offer you some helpful ideas or inspirational ideas for further exploration of the text. There's still so much more to discover that I couldn't cover here due to time constraints. Like, there are some interesting side notes on phosphorus, on the prophet Elijah, the taste of saltwater fish, the many puns on the word already mentioned previously by Molly, metempsychosis, or thoughts like, did nuns invent barbed wire? What is it about the soap scented with elderflower, I think, the role of police informants, the reference to the 2 leap years, and so on and so forth. Maybe we can discuss these in the comments. I really appreciate that. Yeah. Otherwise, we'll be back in about 2 weeks with a video on the next episode, Scylla and Charybdis. And until then, I wish you a great reading time. Have fun, take care, bye-bye, and ciao.